Thank you for joining today's web briefing. The 7 measures breached organizations wish they had in place before an attack that you could do today. As we get started, please note that you could use the Q&A feature that's in the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the conversation today. Please go ahead and feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation, and we'll answer them either along the way, if they're easy ones, or at the end during the Q&A session. Keep in mind that you could sign up for reports, updates, and things like attack briefs on the Avanan website as well, and learn more about how we work with the Gemartian team at avanan.com/dmarc. A recording will be available later today. Now I'd like to introduce your host and our special guest for today's web briefing, Michael Landaway, Avanan's co-founder and Chief Privacy Officer.
Thank you, Michael. Again, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to cover the 7 things that many of our customers have told us, and many research reports tell us that we should do before a breach, not regret after. And we're actually really happy today to have a guest from a partner of ours, Gemartian, Barry Jones. He's the technical product manager for their DMARC solution. And because it's something that he's very familiar with, he's an expert that I am not. He's going to be joining us for that section. Thanks for joining us, Barry.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So we make the assumption that you have done what you can do to prevent attacks on your organization. You've already spent money on secure email gateways. You're using the security that's built in to say Office 365 or Gmail. You may have even invested in advanced threat protection. You've deployed agents on all your desktops. You've trained all of your users. So these are all the things that you've gotten in place, but you were still breached. Something bad happened, something got through. Now, we're often called after a breach takes place for a lot of forensics reasons, for a lot of protection reasons. We've kind of gathered the education we've had, that our customers have had when it comes to post-breach protection, to make a list of those things that you can do to prevent the breach, and hopefully do it before it actually happens. Now, you've trained your users, but because even the very best companies can only get maybe 2 or 3%, down to 2 or 3% click rates, things will get through. You only need to send 10 or 100 different emails to convince one person to open it. So something will get through. Now, the things we're about to mention today, one, are all free. They're things that you can do with no additional investment, maybe a little bit of your time, but more importantly, they're things that can be done very quickly. And they're not little things. These are very, very significant. They can hide 49% of identified phishing, double your phish resiliency, prevent 81% of most breach types, stop 99% of credential attacks, and prevent over 90% of business email compromise losses, block 87% of known malicious URLs, and most importantly, eliminate the #1 source of domain spoofing. So it seems like a lot, but because they're very simple, we'll go them very quickly. So the first thing that most people wish they had done before the breach was to keep users out of the spam folder. Why? Because in our recent Global Phish report, we discovered that while EOP is pretty good at detecting attacks, it blocks only 21% of them. 49% of known phishing emails known to be phishing by Microsoft's protection ends up in the spam folder. And what we've seen is that the more recent attacks are actually convincing enough so that people are browsing their spam folders and actually pulling the attacks out and replying to them. Our recent Reploy attack was so good because it took real emails that users had actually sent, and replied to them with malicious content. So it looked like a continuation of conversation. So users browsing their spam folders said, oh, I know that person. I'm going to open that up and respond. So just by keeping users out of the spam folder, you can eliminate over 49% of phishing attacks that were caught, but users are still falling for. You should treat spam as malicious. You can do this with user policy, or you can do this with policy within your email server, your email clients, to reduce access or eliminate access to the user's junk folder. The next thing you can do, now that you've trained all of your users, you can start rewarding users for reporting phish attacks. Why is this important? Because the benefit of training happens in the first few months. The click rates of people that are falling for phishing attacks falls from above 15, 20% down to 3 or 4% just in a matter of a few months. But we've been training our users for a long time now. And something we found is there's kind of a hard bottom. It's really hard to get that down to 0. And the worst of it is that as we aggressively try to get that down to 0, we're actually starting to have a negative effect. That's because phishing testing has become a punishment. So now when someone gets phished, they get punished by taking 3 minutes out of their day, a very busy day in which they have things to do, and they're forced to go through a 3-minute training. So phishing actually is starting to have a negative effect. More importantly, it's affecting something that is maybe new to you, but should be important. And that is something called resiliency. So users might click on an email, but they're just as able to report a malicious email. And what we found is that reporting is more important than not clicking for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of attacks now don't have URLs. So we've done a really, really good job of keeping people from clicking on URLs, but we're doing a poor job of training them what to do when there is no URL. And a lot of attacks now are taking advantage of that. So we have fileless and URL-less attacks. What's more important, that we train people to report. And what we found is that in a averagely trained organization, the reporting rate can be twice as high as the click rate. So when you're under attack with 10 emails or 100 emails, more of your users will actually report it than click on it, increasing your resiliency from these phishing attacks. And rewarding reporting can be as easy as putting a banner at the top of every email that allows you to report. Most of your software defense packages can do that as a checkbox. Or creating an email address within your organization in which people can forward these phishing emails so that you're aware if 10 people or 100 people are all getting the same type of email attack, you know about it as soon as they do. In fact, some organizations, this is an example from Salesforce, have started rewarding reporting. So stop using the stick and punishing your users and reward reporting to increase your anti-phishing resiliency. So this is something we all know. And it's one of the 7 things we wish we had done before the breach, and that is to fix the mess that are passwords. Most data breaches, 81% of breaches, are because of credential theft. For a lot of reasons. One of them is because 73% of passwords are duplicates. How does that happen? Many times it's because of nothing the users have done. With the hundreds of breaches that have taken place, there are literally 8 billion accounts that have been compromised, complete with email addresses and passwords. There's a site that you should become familiar with called Have I Been Pwned, which allows you to enter your email address and see if it was part of one of those recent breaches. Chances are it has. You can go as far as to check your entire domain. So if you're an administrator, you can check every email address in your domain to see if it was part of a recent breach and whether that breach included just email addresses or email addresses and passwords. One of the problems with these breaches is that now the attackers have literally billions of passwords that are common, passwords that allow them to try and try again. Every day, Microsoft rejects 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts. And what is that? That is invisible to you, the attackers trying over and over again your usernames and passwords from these compromised lists. So your job, your goal is to keep your password from being on these breach lists. And how do you do that? By having a unique one. How hard is that? Very hard, unless you have software to help you. So we recommend, and this should be policy, and because it's free, there's no reason not to, get some sort of password manager. They're free, they're common, and more importantly, they are no longer inconvenient. In fact, it's now more convenient to have a password manager than to not. Now, there are obvious reasons to have a password manager. You get long passwords, it autofills, so you can just click right through. It makes your life easier. But more importantly, they are unique. They are unique to each account. So if your Yahoo account is compromised, it does not compromise your Office account. And it's now ubiquitous. It used to be that it was really great on the websites, but when you're using your phone, how do you cut and paste? You had to rewrite it, and long passwords are complicated. But now there is no excuse. It's built in right to your phone, so you have easy, breezy access to all of your accounts no matter how you're connecting. There's an invisible benefit, and this is probably the most important, which is why, beyond all others, you should be implementing this today, is that it's checking your users for passwords that have already been compromised, weak passwords, reused passwords, old passwords, doing all of that for you. In fact, many times, it can actually reach out and change that password visibly in the background. So your users now gamify good password behavior. And it also changes the user experience when they are under a phish attack. Now, if I go to Microsoft's Live account and log in, I'm given an option to choose one of the many accounts that I have at Microsoft. That's what I expect. That's what works every day. However, if someone sends me a phishing attack with a fake login account, what happens? Nothing happens. My password manager cannot be fooled by even the most creative URL. If I have a URL that looks like a human to a Microsoft login, it won't look like it to my password manager. And so I won't even get an option to log in. Password managers can solve over 80% of attack methodologies. So what's the next step? What's the other thing I should be doing to solve my credential attacks? That is the obvious one, multi-factor authentication. I won't spend too much time on this because this you already know. 99% of credential attacks can be blocked with multi-factor authentication. Who tells us this? Microsoft tells us this, and they analyze literally billions of logins a day. But multi-factor authentication is not all built the same way. We're all familiar with SMS codes, sending a code via text message to your phone. But in an analysis by Google, it's not as effective when it comes to targeted attack. While it may be 100% effective against an automated bot, in a targeted attack, SMS codes are only 76% effective. Now, there are other ways to have multi-factor authentication. You can have a secondary email address, you can have a secondary phone number, or even that last line sign-in location that always tells you about when you use your browser. But you'll notice that those are not as effective. In fact, not effective at all when it comes to targeted attacks. So I'm going to introduce a couple of new options that you may not be familiar with. One of them is an on-device prompt, and the other is the security key. An on-device prompt is an app that runs on your phone that gives you a code that changes every minute. And security key is something that Google in their testing has discovered to be 100% effective against credential attacks. An app on your phone gives you a number every minute, and you can have as many accounts on that as you'd like. This doesn't require access to phones or to the phone system. So you can do this in the isolation of a data center, or the device key that provides secondary authentication is a USB key that plugs into your keyboard and essentially locks you out unless you have it. Those are the two methods that you should investigate because they are much more effective, especially now that in a targeted attack, your attacker may have access to your SMS conversations. So I'm going to introduce a topic to you after talking about multi-factor authentication, which is something called multi-channel confirmation. So if one of your users has been fooled by some sort of phishing attack, a business email compromise attack, convincing them to do something that would be detrimental to them, to your business, to their finances, we recommend changing your business processes. This is not a technical solution. This is a business solution to require multi-channel confirmation of any material request. So if someone sends you an email asking for personal information, for money, something that's material to your business, this should be your policy every single day. It should be familiar to your users to follow up that request with a simple phone call or text message, or what we do all the time is a Slack message. It's ubiquitous, but more importantly, it confirms the identity of the user through a secondary channel. This is a business practice that is starting to become important because of business email compromise, but is starting to spread beyond IT into all organizations within your company. So the sixth thing that provides real value when it comes to preventing attacks is something that is relatively new, but it's free, easy, and has a pretty much global impact immediately. And that is malware blocking DNS. So everyone's familiar with DNS. Whenever somebody clicks on a link, the browser goes out, requests the location of that link, and takes the browser to it. The victim of an email, victim of a phishing attack, clicking on a link will make a DNS query. Unfortunately, every DNS that we're familiar with will reply good or bad. Today, however, we have the option to replace the DNS that our ISP gives us, or using Google or other third party, with a DNS provider that will respond if it's a known good URL, but deny requests to malicious URLs. Quad9 is one of them. It includes the security from over 18 malware vendors. And so it's actually the value of companies that you may already have installed, but most likely you would not be able to afford, and it's all for free. There are other DNS security filters, Quad9 being one of them, OpenDNS, Norton Connect Safe, MotoSecure, Yandex Safe. By making a simple change in your DNS, you are now protecting all of your users from malicious URLs. It's as simple as changing your DNS, but now you have the benefit not of blocking malicious threats. So everything I've described to you in the 7 things so far are things you're probably all familiar with, but hopefully we'll get up to introducing within your organization. But something that I know you may be new to you is the value of setting up DMARC on your domain. What is DMARC? How does it benefit security for your domain and the internet as a whole? Well, that's actually beyond my purview, which is why we've invited Barry Jones, Technical Product Manager from Martian, to first introduce us to DMARC, what it is, how it prevents phishing attacks, and most importantly, what you can do today to make a difference. Barry?
Thank you, Michael. I'm always happy to take an opportunity to spread the good word of DMARC to the world. So if you can just share control here and I'll take over. If you're in the audience today, I would like to invite you to participate in some of the bits of feedback that we have on here. If you open the participants button, if you're using the web interface, there is a raise hand button that's on there. And so a couple of the things that I'm going to be going through here today will have I'll ask for a show of hands from the audience. As I do that, feel free to hit that button if you'd like to chime in, and so I can just get a little bit of feedback. Like a lot of people, I found out about DMARC whenever I needed it, after there was already an incident in progress. About 7 or 8 years ago, I joined a company that was sort of like an eBay, but for a very niche high-end electronics market. And they were going through a transitional period, and the entire system and about 300,000 active users who were buying, selling, and trading on there were inundated with phishing and various forms of fraud. At the time that I did this, DMARC had just sort of been announced to the world. And so I got to dive in and set it up before anybody was really using it. There weren't any helpful resources out there for me. I went through this entire process manually. DMARC was so effective at helping us to resolve things and get things under control that I feel very much compelled to tell everybody about it whenever I get a chance to. I firmly believe that if it had not been for DMARC coming out when it did, that particular company would have gone under. So we're going to talk about securing your domain's email, which will beg the question, why isn't my domain's email secure? Well, in order to get through that, let's do that first show of virtual hands here. How many people in the audience own a domain name? Let's see if I get any hands. Usually we get, usually in an audience, a technical audience or a business audience in general, you're going to see several people, at least that own some domain names. Many of us will go and we'll grab a domain name whenever we have a random crazy business idea. I, for example, dream of one day opening up a pirate-themed gym called Slimmer Ye Timbers. If you're chuckling right now, you think about it. The more you think about it, the more you realize it would work. But like many of us, I have numerous domains that I'm not using right now that I'd like to. I'm sure you do too. And rarely are we using all the domains that we purchase. Hopefully you're using most of them though, or you're using a few of them. But when you use it, did you set up a website? On that website, did you create a contact us form where someone can go and fill in information to send you a question and have that contact us form send from yourdomainname.com, like a no reply address or a contact us at yourdomainname.com. If you did that, why does it work? You didn't do anything special other than go and create the form on the website and have it send an email saying it was from your domain name, but it got delivered. It arrived in the person's email box and you didn't have to do anything else. That's kind of the problem, because it was already turned on before you did anything. That's why we have spam. That's why we have phishing. So by default, every single domain on the internet has email turned on, unless you turn it off. DMARC is your off switch for everyone else. And that's what I'm going to tell you more about today, because that's how we're going to fix this problem. Ideally, if DMARC had been around from much earlier on in the life of the internet, maybe it would be ubiquitous at this point. And you wouldn't have all of these domains that exist out there, things that you had no malicious intent behind by leaving them insecure. But maybe we could put into practice something where things are secure by default. So to dive into DMARC and to understand DMARC, we have to give a brief history of email standards around the email world. Emails are like opinions. Everybody has one, some stink. If we were in a live audience, I'd be assuming that you're laughing right now. But just the most important thing is that there's really no requirements. There's tons and tons and tons of email standards that are out there, but none of them are required. And because none of them are required, everybody who runs an email server that receives email from external sources has to make their own rules. They essentially have to guess. So they're going to end up setting up blacklists. They'll set up IP reputation scores, spam algorithms, but they'll look at the patterns that they see and what they get of what's good and what's bad, and they'll try to build rules around it. And that's why if you send an email to one place, it might end up in the spam folder. If you send an email to another place, it might do fine. You'll see businesses saying, add me to your contact list so that you get my messages, because that's one of the rules that people do. If they see an email address that's in the contact list, they'll decide to use that. And the standards are very much all over the place. In 2018, 300 billion emails were sent each day, and 85% of those were spam. Just to give you an idea of how bad this problem is and how much work goes into trying to block out all the negative stuff that's out there. It is getting better, but this has been the state of affairs that the internet's been built around to get us to this point today. So that's essentially the world that we live in. It's getting better now because despite all of those standards that are out there and all of the standards that people have come up with over the years that they've tried to push from one company or another company to try to kind of get the foothold into controlling the conversation of how things should go, the email world has coalesced around three standards: SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. And what DMARC does is it brings SPF and DKIM together to help the two address each other's gaps. Because both SPF and DKIM are very good, but they're not perfect. So let's talk about the standards. SPF, the Sender Policy Framework. SPF is pretty simple in terms of how it works. It's a DNS record. You don't have to have control of anything else other than your DNS record for your domain. You go and you set up a simple TXT record as your SPF. You can see an example at the bottom of the slide here, right? And went backwards. Sorry. You can see an example at the bottom of the slide right here. You include IP addresses. You can include third-party senders that you might be sending from, because whenever the information that's trustworthy in an email, when an email server receives it, is they know the IP address of the email server that connected to it to deliver the message. And so what an SPF record will do is it'll digest all of this information that's in your record and it will boil it down to IP addresses. And it will look in the email that it received, it will take the IP address and the email that it received, and it will see if it's in the set. And if it is, it knows that it belonged to it. That's basically how it works. And the nice thing about doing the third-party includes is that if you're sending using an external source like Google or something like that for your corporate email, if Google changes the IP addresses that they're sending from, you don't have to do anything. It updates for you. But SPF is not perfect. SPF would be wonderful if every single email was delivered just point to point. But there are other things on the internet that we've used over the years, such as mailing lists, where someone sends an email into a listserv or group server, and then that group server sends the message back out from you or from other members of the group to everyone else in the group. That group server is not in your SPF record. Same thing with if you've ever seen the alumni email addresses from many universities that are out there. Those alumni addresses are basically forwarding addresses. So they point to wherever you're collecting to whatever email address you're actually using. But once the message goes into the alumni address, it's relayed back out from there. And when it's relayed back out from there, the SPF IP origination changes from where the original sender was. And if you have too strict of an SPF policy in place, the policy strictness of SPF is controlled at the end with a little, with where it says all, and it'll have a dash all or a tilde all or a plus all. The tilde all is the right in the middle. Dash all is the incredibly strict. If you set your record to a dash all, you can end up having legitimate email dropped because the rule was too strict. So those things do not survive forwarding. DKIM, domain keys identified mail. DKIM is more complicated. It also involves a DNS record, but it's basically public-private key signing. So, so just at the high level, the outgoing mail server that you're sending from, your SMTP server or your Google or whatever your third-party sender is, if it's a marketing or newsletter tool, that will have the private key at its location. You will put the public key for the DKIM signature in your DNS. And you can have as many domain key signatures in your DNS as you want to. They each get their own URL, or they each get their own subdomain. And the outgoing mail server will use this private key to sign each message that's going out in a way that the receiving email server, when it sees that DKIM signature, it can go and use the public record that's in your DNS, and it can figure out whether or not this signature is legitimate or not. And if it is, it has a very strong reason to believe that it's actually from your domain. These survive forwarding. DKIM signatures will survive forwarding. And it will also identify if a message has been modified in transit somehow. It's a little bit more complex to set up because it requires the private key on each of the outgoing mail servers. But when you're using a third-party sender, that's usually provided by the senders. And the tools around DKIM are getting better and better. But DKIM is also not perfect. So like with any encryption, the strength of the key matters. Otherwise, it can be mathematically brute force. One of the most famous stories of this is a guy named Zachary Harris, who he was contacted by a Google recruiter and then saw that the message from Google was only using a 512-bit DKIM key. The recruiter, knowing that he was a math guy, Zachary assumed that this was actually a test that he was supposed to, that was one of those weird Google tests that he was supposed to figure out that this key was too weak. And so he did. He cracked the key, and then he used the DKIM signature to send an email from Larry Page to Sergey Brin. 2 days later, Google's DKIM key was a 2048-bit key, much stronger and a lot harder to break. In the same vein, key rotation matters. So not just key strength, but key rotation. So when you're looking at a website, for example, and you've got a secure certificate on a website, those secure certificates on a domain name on a website expire. And that expiration forces you to go through and rotate your certificate to update the keys. If they didn't expire, most of us would just let them sit forever. And that's just the nature of the beast. That's just the nature of how we are. Some of the more automated systems will actually rotate every 90 days. And DKIM keys are no different. But the problem is that DKIM keys, because they just sit in your DNS, they don't actually have an expiration on them. And so most people don't rotate them. So if somebody decided that they wanted to target your company and you had a moderate strength key or something like that, they could decide to try to brute force it. And then after a while, figure out what the key was. And as soon as they have that key, then they can include a legitimate DKIM signed signature in a message and claim it's from you. And a receiving email server will have no reason to think that it's not. Key rotation is a big deal. And more and more, a lot of the third-party senders that are out there are getting better at this. It's one of the things that the adoption rate for it is not as strong as we'd like it to be, but it's getting better. If you go to a transactional email sender, and when you're going through the setup process, they give you 2 CNAME records for your domain. That's usually a sign that that you're getting automatic key rotation, because what they'll do is they will use one of those records to sign with one private key. And then after a while, they'll switch to using the second one. And then while you're using the second one, they'll change the first one so that when they go back to the first one, you have a completely new key. And that rotates it for you without you ever having to worry about it. But in lieu of that, just get a stronger key. Try to look for 2048-bit senders when you can, or rotation when you can't. The other flaw in DKIM is that if an email server gets a message when you're sending everything else with DKIM, and they get a message that doesn't have a DKIM signature, the receiving email server has no way of knowing if DKIM's supposed to be there. It just sees a message and it goes back to doing its guesswork. DKIM helps to ensure that the message is legitimate, but if it's not there, we're back to square one. And the other kind of X factor in all this is that when people have gone through and they've set up their SPF and their DKIM, mail servers still don't know how strictly that you've done it. Maybe you went and signed up for one service that made you add this one record to your system, and maybe you went to another one that told you to copy and paste this in, and you overwrote your previous record. There's any number of things that can happen. Sometimes you'll be sending DKIM through one sender, but maybe not through another. And so, all in all, mail servers are going to guess unless you tell them they don't have to. DMARC lets you remove the guesswork. What DMARC does is it lets you put a record in your DNS that says all of my email landscape is up to date, is up to speed. We're doing what we're supposed to do. So you put a record out there, and if a mail server gets an email that does not pass either SPF or DKIM, then you get to tell it, this is not for me. You get to say, if you get an email that says it's for my domain and it doesn't pass DKIM or it doesn't pass SPF, you can either just send it directly to spam or you can just not deliver it at all. And the kicker with that is that it's possible to use a DKIM signature from a domain other than yours. So in order for it to be a legitimate DMARC DKIM signature, it has to have alignment with the sending domain, with the from domain. So if you're sending something that says it's from mydomain.com, the DKIM signature also has to be from mydomain.com. There are levels to this. So whenever you're setting up DMARC, the first question in your mind is always going to be, I don't want to break anything. So you want to put the record out there, but you want to make sure that you're not disrupting any existing email that you're sending. So you can put it out there with a none record to start with, which won't do any enforcement at all, but you can get reports. That's one of the other wonderful things about DMARC, is that you can put an email address in the record and it will send a report every day. Companies that receive email that says it's from you will send you a report every day. So Google, if they get 1,000 messages over the course of the day that say that they're from your domain, Google will send a report to that email address that says, here's everything I got for the day. Here's the IP addresses that where all the email came from that said it was from you. Here's how many messages that I got from each IP. And here's whether or not those messages passed DKIM or SPF and what I did with them. Those reports are extremely valuable because you use those reports to figure out what's going on and if everything that is supposed to be passing is passing, so that when you're ready to flip the switch to an enforceable policy, moving from none to quarantine, something that actually implements a rule, that you can be confident that you're not breaking anything. But you also have the ability to roll it out to a small percentage. You can turn it on and just apply it to 5%, just so you can make sure, say we want to apply this quarantine rule to 5% of emails that are delivered on my behalf, then you can just do that and you can see if you get any support tickets about missing emails. And then if everything's quiet, then you can ramp it up a little bit faster and a little bit faster and a little bit faster. So you get the ability to roll this out in a careful manner. And it is just a simple DNS record. You get a combination of deliverability plus abuse prevention all in one. And so DMARC is essentially preventing anyone else from sending emails saying it's from the domain that you own and control, your corporate domain or whatever other domain you've set it up with. It helps to protect your end users, and it also helps to protect your company itself, because if someone were to send an email saying it was from someone at your company, having that DMARC record in place applies to messages that are coming into you as well. Here's a sample of what a DMARC report looks like. Just a quick example. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's basically a zipped XML file where you can look through. You can kind of see the IP address over here. You get a count. You can see whatever your policy was. That's what the disposition was. You get some information about the email. You get the authentication results, whether or not it passed DKIM or SPF. This is just a very boiled down one, but there's some more information in there as well. So whenever I was setting this up in the first place, I was digging through all these XML reports by hand. There were not a lot of tools out there to help me go through this process. DMARC provides a ton of tools for this stuff. We've got tools to analyze your current record, tools to help you build a record, tools to help you figure out what your SPF record needs to look like and help you build that as well. You can look at your DKIM, you can upload some of your XML reports and figure out what's going on, or you can sign up for an account, get an email address, and we'll process your reports every single day and help you make sense of them. Translating all of those IP addresses that are in there into, this looks like Google or this looks like Microsoft is a lot easier when you have tools that can help break it down. I used to actually have a list of IP addresses and I was manually cross-referencing all the stuff when I was setting it up. So it's a lot easier today. It's also so effective that it's becoming an expectation very, very quickly. The Department of Homeland Security issued a binding operational directive that required federal agencies to be compliant in October 11th of 2018. At that time, 76% of federal agencies were compliant. The Dutch government has added it to their comply or explain list for businesses, which is essentially these are the rules. If you are not following these rules, you better have a very good reason and you better explain it to us. Throughout the rest of the EU, the Dutch government model is supporting the development of other similar laws across other EU countries. It's being adopted in Japan, and it's only continuing to grow. So getting ahead of this now would be much better. It's also your first line of defense against business email compromise or spear phishing or whale phishing. The first time that I ever heard about business email compromise, I did not believe that it was possible. Because you think about phishing emails, you think about people clicking on a website or something, you think about Nigerian print scans and that kind of thing. You don't think that someone in the finance department of a large company can be convinced to wire hundreds of thousands of dollars to a fake entity. I was wrong. Over the last 5 years, these type of scams have cost $12.5 billion. It makes it easy if someone can just send an email to your finance department that looks like it's from the CEO of the company saying, get this invoice paid. And if you make it easier for people to do that, especially if they're targeting, it's going to be a lot more convincing. If you're at least preventing your own domain name from being abused, people have to go out and they have to try to impersonate people in other ways from alternative domains. And there are a lot of tools that make it easier to spot alternative domains or emails coming from people with that look like they're in your organization, but it's not from your actual organization's email. It's a whole lot easier to stop this if you're at least protecting your own domain. But if someone is very determined to, say, crack your DKIM key or compromise your key, if they were an employee that may have had the private key for your DKIM signature, they could still send an email that's going to pass DKIM and impersonate your CEO. That's one of the reasons that DKIM rotation is so important, especially if you're a corporate email. 76% of organizations reported at least one phishing attack. 91% of cyber attacks begin with phishing or spear phishing to gather more information about the company or their vulnerabilities. This is just a quick insertion from a presentation that we did for the anti-phishing working group at their eCrime Summit back in 2018. They let us cross-reference their malicious IP database with as well as their verified phishing database, the IP addresses that were found in those, with all of the sum of DMARC reports that we had at our disposal. And so what we did was we looked for areas of cross-reference with the IPs over billions of records, and we found a subset where things overlapped. And we wanted to look at what the behavior looked like for those IPs that were known to be bad actors. What we found was that when a non-enforceable policy was in place, there was a much higher rate of abuse. You can see whether or not something was passing DKIM and SPF, passing DKIM and failing SPF, passing SPF and failing DKIM, or failing SPF and DKIM. So the green is failing everything. The dark blue is passing DKIM and failing SPF. And what's interesting is that when you look, as soon as there's an enforceable policy in place, that didn't just drop to a low amount. We didn't see any incidences of it. And it's important because a compromised DKIM key would still work if a message was even with an enforceable policy in place, because if the key itself has been compromised. But it's almost as if people decided not to target these companies once they had an enforceable policy in place. You can see nothing on here is passing both SPF and DKIM. And there's also nothing on here that's passing SPF and failing DKIM. But the enforceable policy is interesting. It wasn't just a small amount, it was absolutely nothing. And there's a lot more that could be read into that. There's more research that we need to be done to really understand those numbers better. But because a DMARC record sits at the top level of your domain, and it can also sit on subdomains as well, but because the DMARC record is out there, if someone is going to target a domain for abuse, for email abuse, one of the first things that they should do is to check and see what the DMARC policy is for a domain. And if there's either not a DMARC policy or if the policy is set to none, it's an easy target because everything's disabled. And there's email security companies that are out there that will set up DMARC policies with none for a lot of companies. And it's bad practice, but they do it just to get the reports and use the data on their internal tools without actually protecting your domain from everything else. So as a take-home challenge, if you own domains and you want to help make the internet a better place, one of the things that you can do is you can go and disable the email on the domains that you're not using until you're using them. Adding an empty SPF record and a reject DMARC policy to each of your unused domains will turn off the email effectively for those domains. And then whenever you're ready to use those domains later, then you can go and add things to your SPF record and add your DKIM keys as you add email senders and as you grow. But in the meantime, you're helping with a little bit of housekeeping and you're making sure that your domains aren't being abused until you're actually ready to use them. Thank you, Michael. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a great introduction. I know it's something that was new to me just a year ago, but now I'm learning how important it is when it comes to email security. So we've covered quite a bit, and we're seeing that we have a lot of questions. So I'd like to pass it over to Michael Hiskey, who will give us a summary and give us some of the questions that were asked.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today's web briefing. We have a lot of questions that came in. We'll get to a few of them. And for those of you listening to the on-demand version of the webinar, the recording will stop now, but you could submit questions via email. The first question comes in, what if we're using services which send simulated phishing emails for training purposes? Is this something that we have to add to the allow list? Michael, why don't you start and then pass over to Barry?
Absolutely. I think one thing I do know about DMARC is that it'll be the first to tell you what companies are sending emails under your name, like Google, like KnowBe4. But I'll pass that question on to Barry.
I would generally answer that question by saying it's up to your IT department. Personally, I would want to not add them to the allow list because I want to make the simulated phishing work harder to give you a better view of what can actually get through. So if you're letting a phish impersonate your domain for purposes of internal testing, well, that's going to be foreign if you've got a policy that's actually preventing it. So if you don't have something like that in place, then they've got to send phishing emails from other domains or from Gmail accounts or other things that are set up to look legitimate. And you're going to get a more realistic simulation of what the real world of your company looks like. But in the end, that's going to be a decision for your IT department.
Thanks, Barry. That was a great answer. And certainly we focus on the Avanan side of making sure that those things don't get through in the first place. Next question goes right to you, Barry. Does this solution mean that I would need to know the IP of each of my remote employees that are sending emails, or is that not relevant?
No, your remote employees should be sending not directly from their workstations, but directly through the SMTP server that your IT department has set up. So you'll have an outgoing mail sending server that everyone connects to send the email out for delivery.
And then just a clarifying question, Barry. In order to use DMARC, does that mean I have to first set up SPF and DKIM to activate those first?
Yes.
Okay, that's kind of.
But let me expand on that real quick. Setting up DMARC with a none record while you're going through the process of setting up SPF and DKIM will at least go ahead and get you the reports and the information to help you make that a more effective process.
Outstanding. And then a related question is, and this is an interesting one, how often do you have to update DMARC? Is this a set it and forget it, or are you constantly updating this?
Generally, whenever you get to reject, you tend to forget about it. And it's a thing of the DMARC record itself. Once you've taken care of getting everything updated, you tend to forget about it. But the ongoing process of DMARC is also a little bit of a change in company culture, where if you're adding new senders later on, for example, you have to have an internal process available to make sure that that new sender is getting added to your SPF and their DKIM is set up. It just becomes a part of your email process. And so coaching people on the way to implement those processes at the company effectively is sort of one of the side effects of the organization-wide deployment.
That's great. This last question comes in, and I believe it's for Michael. What's your best advice for password creation?
For password creation, randomize and then use multi-factor auth with and set up a password manager, definitely.
The phrase that I like to use, or probably the one that is probably the most true, is the best password is the password you don't know. The reason you want to use a password manager is it'll make up something that no human could ever remember, so that even if the bad guys come at you with a hammer, there's really nothing you can do.
Yep.
If you trust your password manager, and you should, then it would take years, billions of years, to crack the best passwords.
Absolutely. And getting in the habit of using multi-factor authentication, the YubiKeys and the security keys that are out there are, in my opinion, the best experience also, versus using the multi-factor authentication apps, where with an app you get to the website, you're prompted for the box, you open the phone, find the app on your phone, you scroll down to whatever the code is and you type it in. With a security key, you literally it lights up and you tap it, and that's it. It's more secure and it's a better user experience, which is why I'm a big advocate for them.
Right on. Well, Barry, thank you so much for your time. I'd like to thank both presenters, Michael Landaway, Avanon's co-founder and chief privacy officer, and Barry, a technical product manager from Demartian. You can use the links on the screen as you see. Avanon.com/DMARC will get you access to the slides and eventually the recording from today's presentation. Please sign up for other web briefings and educational information around Avanon at our website, avanon.com. You could also see some recent information there about our being given the distinction of Gartner's Customer Choice for Email Security, as well as some other interesting bits. And then finally, you can get a free trial of both the Demartian offering as well as the Avanon offering, either at the avanon.com/DMARC site, or if you want to go directly to learn more about Demartian specifically, go to demartian.com/7measures, for a special free trial offer from them. We thank you very much for your time and attention and appreciate you joining us today.